Summoners, and welcome to another ProGuides video. I'm Tia, and today I'm going over our Challenger Coach's 5 sleeper OP picks and builds that you should be abusing for some free LP. You probably know the popular OP picks and builds, but if you're trying to take your opponents by surprise, then you gotta try some of these cheese. So hit that sub button and let's get into it. The first thing we'll be taking a look at is a new build for Varus Mid. Usually when you're playing an artillery-style champ, the idea is to whittle your opponents down rather than actually get kills. Think about Xerath and Ziggs. Taking a few of their Qs can send you back to base, but rarely are you actually killed. But this Varus build is different. It allows you to completely one-shot your targets with little room for counterplay. In the past, Varus was one of the most dominant picks of all time in pro play, being so heavily contested that he was an insta-luck for any blue side team when he was left open. This was due to 2 factors. First, Varus had literally no losing matchups. He has good sustained damage thanks to the on-hit from his W, and if he pops his blight stacks, he can burst you down pretty hard. And if you try to sit back out of his auto range, he pokes you down with Q spam. Basically, no matter how you tried to play the lane, Varus would come out on top. Usually champs that are so dominant early game have a fall-off point eventually, but with Varus, that just wasn't the case. At one point, you'd build him on hit with items like Ginsu's Blade of the Ruined King and Renan's Hurricane. Eventually, players realized there was an even more oppressive way to play Varus. Instead of building to hyperscale, they swapped to building lethality. This build allowed Varus to poke squishier targets for more than half their HP. With poke hitting that hard and his Q having a relatively low cooldown, there just wasn't a way to deal with him when he got through. So why does this little backstory matter? Well, like most champs that dominate pro play, Varus was nerfed completely into the ground. So much so that for the second half of Season 10, his win rate hovered around the mid-40s. With the new Season 11 item changes, he improved a bit, but was nowhere near breaking through as a top-tier pick in either mid or bot lane. As a result, Riot has been cautiously buffing him up, with Varus seeing a bit of love on 4 different patches so far in the season. The thing is, we actually first caught wind of this build right before 11.7 went live. So even before this buff to his AD, we saw that this rune and item setup turns Varus into a one-shotting monster. So with all this preamble out of the way, what's the actual build? For items, you'll start Tear of the Goddess, which you'll upgrade into Manamune as your first item. Pick up Tier 1 boots, build into Luden's Tempest, then upgrade your boots to Sork shoes. After that, build Horizon Focus, Void Staff, and Rabadons. For runes, your keystone will be Dark Harvest. Electrocute is also viable and gives you even stronger burst, but requires you to get close enough to land an E to proc it. Your other runes are Cheap Shot, Eyeball Collection, Ultimate Hunter, Absolute Focus, and Gathering Storm, with the stat runes being Ability Haste, Adaptive Force, and either Armor or Magic Resist depending on your lane opponent. The entire point of this build is to one-shot your opponents in a single combo. Once you have Horizon Focus done, you'll look to catch out your enemies anytime you can. Like most artillery-style builds, you'll really shine when sieging towers or when your team sets up to dance around Baron or Dragon. Your Q poke alone obviously doesn't hit as hard as the standard full lethality, but once you catch an enemy moving up too far, you can land an ult and take them out. Just be sure that when you ult someone, you aren't immediately hitting them with your Q. When you ult someone as Varus, it actually takes a couple of seconds for the 3 blight stacks to appear on them. A huge portion of your damage comes from popping those blight stacks. So if you Q your target early, you won't be one-shotting them. A complete one-shot build like this may seem like your ticket to the Freelo Express, but it's not entirely that simple. It's not insanely OP until you reach your 3rd fully completed item. So you need to have laning skills like knowing when and how to trade, and how to manage the wave to survive as an immobile ADC in the mid lane. If you lack skills like that, you just end up being camped by junglers and fall so far behind you never actually reach the fun part of this build. Thankfully, we've got you covered. At ProGuides.com, our top-tier coaches can help you master those basic but oh so crucial skills so you can learn to abuse OP picks like this one properly. So stop spinning your wheels without a clue as to how to improve. Just head on over to our site and book your session right meow. Up next, we have Karma Top, a pick that isn't exactly new, but is still being overall slept on. The reason Karma Top is so successful is that she's able to completely neutralize even the most oppressive top laners, using her Q to poke and wave clear and E and W to kite around opponents. With her Mantra W, you can even use Karma to duel those opponents. At some point, most top laners will reach a point where you can no longer take them in a 1v1. But that doesn't really matter since you'll be transitioning to a more support style of role. You can still go and catch waves as you need to, but your main focus will be on grouping with your team and playing like any other enchanter. But since you have the gold income of a top laner, you'll have more items than if you had been playing Karma as a support in the bot lane, and as a result, you'll have a much bigger impact in teamfights. For items, you'll be starting Doran's Ring and building into Moonstone Renewer, Lucidity Boots, Staff of Flowing Water, and Ardent Censer. After that, you'll want some haste, so pick up Chemtech Putrefier and then make your last item a situational one. Zhonya's and Mikhail's are two solid choices if you need their actives, but if you don't need anything in particular, you can just pick up a Rabadon's for even bigger shields. For runes, you'll bring Airy, Mana Flow, Transcendence, Gathering Storm, Shield Bash, and Revitalize, with the stat runes being Ability Haste, Adaptive Force, and either Armor or Magic Resist for your lane opponent. Shield Bash gives you much more trading strength, but if you aren't going to be super aggro in lane, you can swap your secondaries to Presence of Mind and Legend Tenacity to ensure that you don't go in teamfights. Before we go on to our next pick, Karma Top isn't always a broken pick. Enchanters only work well in teamfights when your team has a front line to protect the rest of your allies in a teamfight. So you'll want to make sure either your jungler or support is playing some sort of champ that can fill that role before locking her in. If you blindly lock in Karma, you'll end up in some games where your team can't actually fight 5v5s, and you'll become useless outside of the laning phase. As I pointed out, Karma is a ranged lane bully that can actually scale into teamfights pretty well since she fills the niche of being a Moonstaff abusing enchanter that can greatly enable the rest of her team. But other ranged solo laners are entirely reliant on doing well in lane phase. Champs like Lucian and Quinn are basically entirely useless if they don't completely stomp lane. Spoilers, they don't usually play in my games. And that brings me to today's question of the day. What champ do you think is super overrated? Let us know your answers down in the comments below. Our third sleeper pick is Karthus as a bot laner. In almost all cases, when you see Karthus locked in, it's going into the jungle. The idea of AFK farming your camps may be appealing to you as the Karthus player, since it gives you a sense of guaranteed scaling in the PvE role. But then your team has to deal with the fact that their jungler isn't putting on a lot of pressure, especially in the early game. It's not that Karthus can't gank at all, but he's definitely overshadowed in that department by the more OP meta picks in the jungle like Hecarim, Elise, and Nunu. So with jungle being the one role responsible for controlling the entire map early game, why not leave that to those champs and take him into a lane? In top lane, almost all of the meta champs can close the gap in the long lane and punish you hard early, so you aren't able to consistently get good enough matchups here, and his top lane win rate in Plat Plus is around 47%. Mid lane is a shorter lane, so it's definitely better, but still the assassins in this lane can bully you hard. Still, it's more consistent than top, having a 52% win rate. But then, there's bot lane. While it may be a relatively small sample size, having a massive 57% win rate has to mean something. Karthus does so well as a bot laner because of the dynamic of having a lane partner. Think about those solo lanes again. If someone kills you in a solo lane, they get to just walk away from your passive. But in bot lane, they have to deal with another champ. So they're either killing your support first, with you railing them with your Qs the entire time, or they dive past your support to kill you, and then have to fight your support on your passive. Either way, it's a lose-lose situation for your opponents. And this is all assuming they can even try to fight you. In most bot lane matchups, Karthus is able to perma-shove the wave with Q spam after picking up Lost Chapter, so you're able to avoid fighting altogether in the 2v2. Just like Jungle Karthus, you can use this to safely farm up to 6 and use your ult to influence fights on the other side of the map. Now, for the build. For items, you'll start off with Doran's Ring and pick up a Lost Chapter. Next, grab Sorg Shoes and then upgrade your Lost Chapter into either Liandry's Anguish or Luden's Tempest. Liandry's is better against beefier champs, while Luden's works best against squishies, so go with whatever suits your needs most. After your Mythic, go Rabadon's, Void Staff, Zhonya's, and Demonic Embrace. Now, many people opt for an earlier Zhonya's, but your passive exists for a reason. You should be building as much damage as possible and getting right into the middle of fights. For runes, you'll want Dark Harvest, Taste of Blood, Eyeball Collection, Ultimate Hunter, Presence of Mind, and Last Stand, with the stat runes being Ability Haste, Adaptive Force, and Armor. Looking back at the top lane, our next pick is Trundle Top, specifically as a counter pick to tanks. A huge complaint from many bruiser players is how frustrating it is to have to lane against tanks. Because even if you stomp them early game, they get to build specifically to counter you, and eventually they outscale you both in 1v1s and teamfights. You can have 3 or 4 items and do basically no damage to a tank that just has Sunfire, Thornmail, and Steel Caps. So even with your massive lead, you can't split push to take towers. And that's all assuming you somehow got ahead early. If you go into the mid game even with a tank, odds are they're throwing their weight around and bullying you hard in the side lane. Being that Maokai is the only top laner I play, I love when the enemy jungler comes to help his side laner only for me to turn the fight and pick up a kill or 2 for myself. Darius is a really solid anti-tank pick. In fact, having a beefy target to smack gives him a way to stack up his passive, with his Q heals making him completely comfortable in fighting as long as he needs to bring down whatever Titan he is fighting. That said, Darius is also an incredibly popular ban. And besides that, this is a video on sleeper picks, and everyone already knows how busted Darius is. And that's where Trundle comes in. Trundle can dominate lane phase against champs of all classes, with tons of sustain from his passive, strong damage output in trades, and the AD steal on his Q making him especially good at shutting down other fighters. But what makes him so good at beating tanks is his ult, which steals a huge 40% of their armor and MR for 8 seconds. This gives you 2 different tactics that you can use to beat down tanks. The first is to play Trundle exclusively as a side laner. When you do this, you'll use the wave clear from your Hydra to constantly push waves in, and therefore threatening to take turrets. Most tank opponents won't be small-brained enough to engage alone. They'll wait for their jungler to come help and attempt to bring you down 2v1. But this is them playing right into your hands. Since the jungler is going to be a lot squishier than the tank top laner, what you'll do is wait for them to overcommit to the fight, ult the tank to steal their stats, and then beat down the jungler. With the resists and HP you steal from the tank, you'll actually be out healing their damage despite the numbers advantage. The second option is to play like a standard top laner, catching waves as you need to and grouping with your team for objectives. If you do this, you'll be using your ult to shred the tanks as they engage, allowing your teammates to shred them while also letting you become a tank for 8 seconds in the fight. On a more specific note, your pillar can even be used to prevent some tanks from landing their ult. You can fully block Sion ult, knock Ornn back to prevent it from casting his ult a second time, and with perfect timing, you can even displace some champs out of dashes and jumps. So now that you're sold on the pick, let's talk about the build. For items, you'll start Doran's Blade and build into a Tiamat ASAP. After that, pick up your Merc Treads and build into Divine Sunderer. And then if you want to build exclusively for split pushing, upgrade your Tiamat into Ravenous Hydra, and then build Blade of the Ruined King, Spirit Visage, and Death's Dance. If you're going to go off with a standard playstyle of grouping for objectives, you'll want to build a bit more beefy. Turn Tiamat into Titanic Hydra, then go Steric's Gauge, Spirit Visage, and Death's Dance. If you still feel like you want to be tankier, you can swap out Death's Dance for something like Thornmail or Randuin's Omen. For runes, the standard setup for split pushing will be Conqueror, Triumph, Alacrity, Last Stand, Demolish, and Revitalize. If you plan on grouping with your team, you'll want to trade out Alacrity for Tenacity against CC heavy comps, and you'll want to take Conditioning over Demolish. For stat runes, run Attack Speed, Adaptive Force, and Armor or Magic Resist. Finishing off our list, we have Garen Mid as a counter to Assassins. One of the most popular questions I see from mid laners that come to us for coaching is how to deal with some of the overbearing champs like Katarina, Zed, and Fizz. Well, the problem is, a lot of matchups are skill-based, and even then, they are heavily favored to the assassin if they know what they're doing. Take Syndra versus Fizz. If you try to QE Fizz, he can hop over the stun with his E, then go for an all-in against you. If you try to answer these assassins with an assassin pick of your own, you're still in the same boat. If you're the first one to make a mistake, your opponent is going to snowball ahead, and he'll just roll over your team in fights while you're pretty much useless because you're so far behind. So why don't we take a different approach? With Garen, instead of worrying about stressful concepts like outplay, timing, and skill, you can just brute force any assassin matchup, completely neutralizing their lane phase and preventing them from ever being able to get a lead. Even when a bit behind, most assassins reach a point where they can one-shot other squishy mid laners as long as they aren't totally out of the game. But with Garen, the combination of your Q's silence and your W's damage reduction and shield make it so that they can never find a way to win a trade against you. With Garen requiring next to no mechanics, all you have to do is learn the timing for your W against different champs, and you'll win trades with no effort at all, as your opponent breaks a sweat just trying to put a scratch on you. On top of you dominating them in the 1v1, in teamfights you'll be able to stick to them, using your Q to silence them, mowing them down with E, and finishing them off with ult, all before they can reach your squishy backliners. It's all pretty foolproof, so if you've been struggling to find an answer to Assassin's Mid, look no further. Now, let's talk about the build. For your items, start Doran's Shield or Doran's Blade. This is pretty much up to preference, with Shield being more consistent and Blade being a more offensive, slightly higher risk, higher reward starter. Rush Berserker's Greaves, then build into Stridebreaker as your mythic. After that, go for Stormrazor and Deadman's Plate, with the rest of your items depending on what you need for your game. Some good general items for damage and durability are Steric's Gauge, Thornmail, Randuin's Omen, Force of Nature, and Spirit Visage. But if you're feeling spicy and want to go full damage, you can go Phantom Dancer, Infinity Edge, and Lord Dominic's Regards. Glass Cannon Garen is pretty fun, but make sure you avoid the 5v5s where you'll totally be melted. For runes, you'll want Conqueror, Triumph, Alacrity or Tenacity, Coup de Grace, Demolish, and Conditioning, with the stat runes being Double Adaptive Force and either Armor or Magic Resist. Meta champs are great and all because they win games, but the real Chads know that off-meta is really where it's at. These champs can sometimes be harder to learn because there's less content around them and less pro games to analyze. So if you want to try these out, talk with a coach at ProGuides.com to walk you through them. We even got 20% off at checkout. Anyway, if you enjoyed the video, then sub for good luck in your games, because I did a hex that one video. And remember to let us know what champ you think is super overrated down in the comments below. I can't wait to see you guys back for the next video, but until then, good luck on the Rift, stay safe, and summer bodies! Summer bodies! Summer bodies! Summer bodies!